yung ballpen mo. Di ka ba nagtataka kung paano nakapunta to dito sa Pilipinas?
Oh, saan magaling yun?
Nakasulat dito, made in Japan, no?
Ano? Paano kaya?
Kaya, ang topic namin ay International Trade Theories and Development Strategies. Welcome to Econos!
Economies of the world for the past decades and so has steadily become more connected. So the reason for this is because of our reliance in the market, the international trade of manufactured goods and services, and the investments like foreign investments and international trade. So before we proceed in our main topic, which is the international trade, let's define first the words that has a relation to it. So globalization, I think we are all aware of what globalization means since it was often used whenever we talk about the development and the trade. So globalization is the process by which the economies of the world become more integrated, leading to a global economy and increasingly global economic policy making. So it's like it's where people, ideas, and goods spread throughout the world. Where mas nabibigyan ng mas malaking chance na magkaroon ng interaction and integration between the countries and its own cultures, governments, and economies. And when we talk about globalization and trade, doon na pumapasok yung global culture kung saan yung mga tao is magko-consume ng similar goods and services across countries. But in economic meaning or the economic globalization, nagre-refer siya sa pagiging open ng isang bansa and their economy to international trade, financial flows, and foreign investment. So maraming naaapektuhan sa globalization but the effect is more visible to developing countries. So when people hear the word globalization, naiisip agad natin that it is beneficial to us, like there's the business opportunities, the gains from trade, the more rapid growth.
5 basic questions about trade and development. So for these 5 questions, there are answers or suggested answers, but they are not uniform because for each developing country, simultaneously, they possess different economies. Merong mga countries na mabilis mag-grow through their income and yung expansion ng industrial capacity nila. Meron ding mga bansa na hindi enough yung resources and manpower para sa huge population nila. Countries with abundant resources and at the same time, low number of populace. And others which are small and economically weak because they don't have an adequate human capital nor the material resources. Bawat bansa may iba-ibang resources, technologies, social institutions, and yung capacity nila for growth and development. Developing countries are no exception to this rule. Kaya for each country, there are no exact answer. They'll come up with different answer depending always on the circumstances and situation of the country itself. So to answer these questions, kailangan malaman or dumaan sa trade performance in developing countries and its patterns. One has to learn what is the effect of international trade to the 4 basic economic concepts, which are the efficiency, equity, stability, and growth. These are related to the 5 basic questions. Today's developing nations have to function in the imperfect and often highly unequal real world of international commerce. There is high diversity among developing countries. Developing countries, they are more dependent on trade than developed countries. Yung mga developing countries, ina-allocate nila yung malaking share of their output as merchandise exports. However, as a group, less developed countries, they are more dependent on foreign trade than the very highly developed countries. High share of exports in GDP is due to higher relative prices of non-traded services in developed than in developing countries. But developing countries are more dependent on trade in international economic relations because most trade is in merchandise, for which price disparities are smaller across countries. Large countries are less dependent on trade than small countries. Less dependent din sila in foreign trade in terms of national income than most relatively small countries. While yung mga low-income countries, they are detached from global economy. Newly industrializing countries like the South Korea, they hold the dominant position in developing country exports. Demand elasticities and export earnings and stability. Income elasticity of demand. It measures of how much demand for a good or service changes relative to a change in income. As income rise, demand for income elastic goods or services will increase because people will have more money to spend. Income elastic goods include luxuries like airline travel, movies, restaurant meals, and automobiles. At the same time, demand for income inelastic goods or services tends to increase only marginally. Consumer staples like toothpaste and items like tobacco and alcohol tend to fall into this category. Price elasticity of demand. It is an economic measure of the change in the quantity demanded or purchased of a product in relation to its price change. If the quantity demanded of a product exhibits a large change in response to changes in its price, it is termed elastic. That is, quantity stretched far from its prior point. If the quantity purchased has a small change in response to its price, it is termed inelastic or quantity didn't stretch much from its prior point. The more easily a shopper can substitute one product with a rising price for another, the more the price will fall be elastic. In other words, in a world where people equally like coffee and tea, if the price of coffee goes up, people will have no problem switching to tea, and so the demand for coffee will fall. This is because coffee and tea are considered good substitutes to each other. Export earnings and stability, wide fluctuations in developing country earnings on commodity exports resulting from low price and income elasticities of demand leading to erratic movements in export prices.
The traditional theory of international trade.
There are three traditional trade theories mentioned in the book, but we would only focus on Ricardo and Mill's classical comparative advantage theory and Heckscher and Ohlin's factor endowment theory. Ricardo and Mill's classical advantage theory. As defined in the book, comparative advantage is the production of a commodity at a lower opportunity cost than any other alternative commodities that could be produced. And due to this, there is a so-called specialization, which defined as the concentration of resources in the production of relatively few commodities. The principle of comparative advantage asserts that a country should and under competitive conditions will specialize in the exports of the product that it can produce at the lowest relative cost. The classical comparative advantage was modified by Elie Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin to take into account differences in factor supplies, mainly land, labor, and capital, on internal specialization. Thus, created the Heckscher-Ohlin Neoclassical factor endowment theory, impact of economic growth on trade patterns, and the impact of trade on the structure of national economies and on the differential returns or payments to various factors of production. Main conclusions of the neoclassical model of free trade are that all countries gain from trade and world output increases with trade. However, there are several others in addition to this basic conclusion. 1. Countries will tend to specialize in products that use their abundant resources intensively. 2. International wage rates and capital costs will gradually tend towards equalization. 3. returns to owner of abundant resources will rise relatively. And 4. Trade will stimulate economic growth. The critique of traditional free trade theory in the context of developing country experience. 6 assumptions of the Neoclassical model. 1. Fixed resources, full employment, and international factor immobility. 2. Fixed, freely available technology and consumer sovereignty. 3. Internal factor, mobility, and perfect competition. 4. Governmental non-interference in trade. 5. Balanced trade and international price adjustments. And 6. Trade gains accruing to nationals. These are some conclusions on trade theory and economic development strategy. Trade can lead to rapid economic growth under some circumstances. Trade seems to reinforce existing income inequalities. Trade can benefit developing countries if they can extract trade concessions from developed countries. Developing countries generally must trade. And lastly, regional cooperation may help developing countries.
So pagkatapos natin itakal yung problems and issues ng trade policies, ngayon, i-discuss naman natin kung paano i-address yung mga problem na yun. A traditional way to address the complex issues of appropriate trade policies for development is either looking outward or looking inward. So bakit ko nasabing traditional ways itong dalawang ito? A lively debate regarding these two philosophical approaches has been carried on in the development of literature since the 1950s. Sa debate ito, dominated siya ng mga free traders or outward-looking scholars compared sa protectionist o inward-looking scholars. So what is an outward-looking policy? This is the policies that encourage exports, often through the free movement of capital, workers, enterprises, and students. So mapapansin nyo sa definition natin na hindi lang capital ang ini-encourage na magkaroon ng movement ng free traders. Kasama din dyan yung mga workers, enterprises, and students. So basically, sinasuportahan din nila yung pagtatrabaho abroad, yung pag-aaral sa international schools, at pag-business sa ibang bansa. Next, ano naman ang inward-looking development policies? Policies that stress the need for nations to evolve their own styles of development. So ang mga protectionist, naniniwala sila sa principle na learning by doing, which means dapat silang mag-consume o mag-produce sa kung anong resources lang yung meron sa bansa nila. In addition, naniniwala rin sila sa greater self-reliance can be accomplished by restricting trade. Bakit? Kasi kung nakikipag-trade daw siya sa iba, possible na ma-adapt niya yung knowledge, skills, or culture na hindi naman angkop dun sa resources na meron sila, and thus, preventing them to develop and grow. In modern times, tinatawag at mas pinalalim ang dalawang traditional policies na ito. Nagkaroon ng import substitution at export promotion. So yung import substitution, equivalent lang siya ng inward-looking, at yung export promotion naman ay outward-looking. Import substitution, a deliberate effort to replace consumer imports by promoting the emergence and expansion of the domestic industries. So basically, ito yung policy na nagdi-discourage sa paggamit ng imported products while promoting yung domestically made products. Export promotion, governmental efforts to expand the volume of a country's export. Ginagawa nila itong export promotion na ito through increasing export incentives and decreasing the burden for a product to be exported. Effects and results of import substitution. Number 1. Overprotectionism. With overprotectionism, there will be less competition, no comparative advantage, or specialization. It also results to inefficiency since product could be imported from more efficient foreign producers. Number 2, high government intervention can actually lead to consumption and misallocation of funds. Number 3, limited possibilities for long-term growth. Limited lang yung resources ng isang bansa kaya di mo alam kung masasustain ba nito yung mga goals and ambitions ng citizens for the long run. Number 4, increase in domestic employment. Since inward looking ang import substitution, magkakaroon ng chance ang mga citizens na makakuha ng trabaho kasi wala na silang kakompetensya na foreigners. Dagdag pa dyan ay ang pagdami ng local businesses. Number 5, less long distance transportation of cost. So since limited na pag-export ng goods, services, bababa yung transportation cost na papasanin ng mga mamimili dahil within the country na lang i-deliver ang mga goods. Lastly, effects and results of export promotion. Number 1, earning of foreign exchange. Dahil nagkikater nga ng different customers all over the world, possible na kumita na ng iba't ibang currencies. Therefore, pwede mong i-capitalize yung pag-appreciate ng currency nila. Number 3, encouragement of efficiency in production. Dahil yung export promotion, expose siya sa high level of competition from foreign producers. Mas may encourage pa yung mga industries na mag-produce ng quality products para makapag-compete sa changing environment. And lastly, loss focus on local markets. Possible na take for granted yung local markets kasi yung policies na ginagawa mo is nakapokus lang sa mga foreign investors or dun sa mga export programs. In the long run, possible na mag-cause ito ng local fragmentation.
So ngayon, i-discuss naman natin ang industrialization strategy approach to export policy. First,
the industrialization strategy approach had emerged around mid-1980s concerning the relationship between trade and development. It is the outward-oriented and optimistic about export-led development, but still envisions an active role for government in influencing the type and sequencing of exports as a country strives to produce more advanced products, adding higher value. This began primarily as an empirical literature but has developed a theory to explain why an interventionist strategy toward exports can accelerate growth and improve development outcomes more than a strict free trade approach. Industrialization strategies or industrial policies are programs that have very active government interventions to encourage industrial exports and to attempt to move up the ladder of comparative advantage toward more advanced products, generating higher value added by employing higher skills and higher technology. Industrial policies can be designed to attempt to complement market forces, providing incentives to sustainably undertake activities on a for-profit basis that are socially efficient but needs some complementary inputs and initial conditions to get underway. Economic integration is an arrangement among nations that typically includes the reduction or elimination of trade barriers and the coordination of monetary and fiscal policies. It aims to reduce costs for both consumers and producers, and also reduce the cost of trade, improve the availability of goods and services, and increase consumer purchasing power in member nations. One example of economic integration is the European Union that was created in 1993 and included 28 member states in 2019. Since 2002, 19 of those nations have adopted the euro as a shared currency. According to the International Monetary Fund or IMF, the EU accounted for 0.04% of the world's gross domestic product. The United Kingdom voted in 2016 to leave the EU. As of late August 2019, no firm agreement on the terms of its departure had been settled. A best-case scenario was for a transition period to avoid severe disruption, delaying the full impact of the departure until late 2020. An economic union is considered one of the different types of trade blocs. It refers to an agreement between or among countries that allows products and workers to cross borders freely. It aims to eliminate internal barriers and adopting external barriers toward the free movement of resources. One example of an economic union is the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a political and economic union of states in Central and Northern Eurasia. A regional trading bloc is a group of countries within a geographical region that protect themselves from imports from non-members. Trading blocs are a form of economic integration and increasingly shape the pattern of world trade. There are several types of trading bloc: custom unions, free trade area, and common market. Custom unions involve the removal of tariff barriers between members, plus the acceptance of a common external against non-members. This means that members may negotiate as a single bloc with third parties, such as with other trading blocs or with the WTO. Free trade areas are created when two or more countries in a region agree to reduce or eliminate barriers to trade on all goods coming from other members. Common market, or also known as single market, occurs when member countries trade freely in all economic resources, not just tangible goods. This means that all barriers to trade in goods, services, capital, and labor are removed. In addition, as well as removing tariffs, non-tariff barriers are also reduced and eliminated. The next topic is about trade policies of developed countries, the need for reform and resistance to new protectionist pressures. The Uruguay round was the last of 8 completed rounds of the GATT. Discussion for the round began in Montevideo, Uruguay in 1986 and it was hoped that the round would be completed by 1990. However, impasses were frequent and the round was not finalized until 1994. One reason for the delay is that this round incorporated many issues in the negotiations. In earlier rounds, the primary focus was always a continuing reduction in the bound tariff rates charged on imported manufactured goods. As a result of 7 completed GATT rounds, by the mid-1980s, tariffs in the main developed countries were as low as 5% to 10% and there was less and less room for further liberalization. At the same time, there were a series of trade issues that sidestepped the GATT trade liberalization efforts over the years. In those areas like agriculture, textiles and apparel, services, and intellectual property, trade barriers of one sort or another persisted. Thus, the ambitious objective of the Uruguay round was to bring those issues to the table and try to forge a more comprehensive trade liberalization agreement. The goals were reached by establishing a series of supplementary agreements on top of the traditional tariff reduction commitments of the GATT. The 3 major provisions from the perspective of developing nations are the following. Number 1. Developed countries cut tariffs on manufactures by an average of 40% and 5 equal annual reductions. Developing countries in turn agreed to not raise tariffs by bonding in recent trade reforms. Despite these reductions, developing countries still face tariffs that are 10% higher than the global average, while the least developed countries face tariffs that are 30% higher. Trade in agricultural products came under the authority of the WTO and were to be progressively liberalized. Although progress was made at first, agricultural subsidies subsequently returned to record highs. For textiles and apparel, the multi-fiber arrangement quotas, which long penalized export of developing countries, were phased out in 2005, with most of the progressive reductions taking effect toward the end of the period, but tariffs on textile imports were reduced only to an average of 12%, 3 times the average level of tariffs on other imports.